Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're going to be continuing with Tafsir al-Qurtubi, of course, what we were talking about last time, which, of course, you could see we're in Surah Al-Araf. And yesterday, let's look at what we did yesterday really quick before we jump into anything. فَلَنَسْأَلَنَّ الَّذِينَ أُرْسِلَ إِلَيْهِمْ وَلَنَسْأَلَنَّ الْمُرْسَلِينَ. So basically, who's going to be questioned? Well, basically those that had to receive the prophets and the messengers. In other words, where this is talking about all the people. وَلَنَسْأَلَنَّ الْمُرْسَلِينَ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will also ask the prophets and the messengers, or is it Jibril alayhi salam? We talked about those. And we also talked about that the question, or at least the type of interrogation, let's call it that way, that will be directed the at the people is different than the questioning of the prophets and the messengers. So the interrogation of those basically that had the message delivered to them, it would be more of the type of questioning or interrogation that is to expose them. Versus when the prophets and the messengers are being asked, it is not to expose them, but it is to bring an affirmation and an evidence and a witness against those that had rejected the prophets. Okay, so let's do it this way. If we're basically at let's say a court hearing, okay, and then somebody is being interrogated. Did you do this? Did you open this? What time was that at, etc.? And there's a difference between asking the person that is indicted, or at least that is right now being accused of committing a crime, and between asking those that are witnesses. Okay, so the witnesses, they're not going to be indicted unless they commit, a lie, and they do, engage in any fraud. That's a different story. But we're talking about generally when you're asking perhaps a witness, maybe a police officer that put the note, or perhaps maybe the people that witnessed the case, they're not going to be asked those questions the same way that you would ask the person that is probably right now a possible maybe indicted person. So that would be a completely different way of asking the questions. The questions are different. The way that both personalities react and act, and of course, and the way that those questions are posed them are completely different. So that's the same thing. That the ones that had rejected the message, the way that they would be asked is more as a way to humiliate them, to expose them, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already knows the answer. وَلَنَسْأَلَنَّ الْمُرْسَلِينَ. That's not a question of interrogation, but that is a question of a witness. Okay? Of a witness. فَلَنَقُصَّنَّ عَلَيْهِمْ بِعِلْمٍ وَمَا كُنَّا غَائِبِينَ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will inform them. And that's فَلَنَقُصَّنَّ. We talked about فَلَنَقُصَّنَّ, and we said it's exactly like we're speaking about a scissors, and it's basically cutting through. In other words, it's going to cut through, it's going to go through each and every single detail, and basically question and interrogate and hold accountable and expose basically each and every single detail. And that's going to be bi'ilm. That's going to be based on the knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had already known about them. وَمَا كُنَّا غَائِبِينَ. وَمَا كُنَّا غَائِبِينَ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was not absent from any of this. وَالْوَزْنُ يَوْمَئِذٍ الْحَقِّ. And we pretty much spent most of yesterday's class basically just on this wording. وَالْوَزْنُ يَوْمَئِذٍ الْحَقِّ. We said, is it speaking about that day when al-mizan, or the scale, would basically be put in front of everyone, weighing people's deeds? Is that basically right here in this ayah? Is this what it refers to as al-haq? That is, there's no question, there's no doubt that this will happen. Or is this referring to the mizan itself will be very accurate, that it will be reflecting justice? Okay, but of course, that does not negate that il-mizan itself is actually something that we know is true, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala And the different hadith had actually talked about the presence of al-mizan, the scale or a measurement tool that will weigh people's deeds. Same thing if we were talking about a sirat, same thing if we're talking, which is the bridge between hellfire and Jannah, and same thing if we're talking about Jannah, Nar. These are not metaphors. This is not something that is symbolic, but these are real things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created. Now, describing them or interpreting Jannah, Nar, deeds, Hasanat, Sayyi'at, and interpreting them as if they are figurative things or some kind of an energy or some kind of a force, or speaking about, let's say, Hasanat and Sayyi'at, this is just to describe ethics and as acceptable, not acceptable, or in any way of describing things in at least interpreting the different things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned as what, even though they are part of al-ghaib, but describing them or interpreting them as a metaphor or some kind of an energy or force is definitely a form of kufr. Keep that one in mind. It is a form of kufr because it is denying what the Quran had actually said. So believing that Jannah is not a real thing, but it is just some kind of a way to let you feel that the impact of being good, it's like being in a beautiful place and all of that, but it's not a factual thing. That is kufr. Interpreting Jannah, Nar, or interpreting Malaika, that they don't exist. It's just Malaika are just good things that would basically bring you good force or anything of that sort. That's kufr. And this is very important to mention because right now, especially with, we're seeing a lot of, the psychology department had adopted a lot of the therapy, let's say, methods from different Eastern religions. And in particular, Eastern religions, we're talking about Buddhism, we're talking about shamanism, we're talking a number of different Eastern religions, and of course, adopted them as ways to bring therapy, mental healing, and all of that. And unfortunately, right now, it is presented that this is the way to bring about mental healing. This is the way to help people get treatment and so forth, and not recognize that the origin of all of this. And unfortunately, we're blindly taking it as if this is what science says. And right now, we're living in an age where science is presented as if it is a god, as if it is something that is nothing but a factual area of resources that we just have to accept as if it is a fact, as if it was nothing but wahi. And certainly we have to be very aware of where these resources are coming from. And certainly we have our resources as Muslims. Okay, now to go back to it. فَمَنْ ثَقُلَتْ مَوَازِينُهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. And we talked about al-mizan right there, and it being heavy, and we talked about the good deeds, and we also talked about a hadith in Sahih Muslim, hadith in Sunan Ibn Majah, and we talked about a number of different hadiths, so no need to go to them. We left off at this one. وَلَقَدْ مَكَّنَّاكُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَجَعَلْنَا لَكُمْ فِيهَا مَعَايِشَ قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ. Now, a couple of things that we need to say about this one when we say, when we talk about مكناكم في الأرض. And we yesterday talked about makana to be very similar to the word machine. It's the ka was actually flipped into a sheen in the word machine. But even if you were to write it, machine, M-A-C-H, okay, that C-H, all right, makan, and it actually comes from it. It actually comes from that root, okay? Now, regardless of the root of it, in Lugha Arabiya, we said ma kana has a number of different meanings. Number one, ma kana means to occupy a place. That's the first one, that number one meaning. To occupy a place, which is one thing that, of course, let's see right there, wanted to show you this one. And what الطاهر ibn Ashur actually said in regards to this one. وَلَقَدْ مَكَّنَّاكُمْ. Hold on, let me just get the best picture for you. All right, and in order for you to see what الطاهر ibn Ashur had to say, وَلَقَدْ مَكَّنَّاكُمْ. Here we go. So التمكين, he basically said right there, so this is basically occupying a certain space. That's the root of it. مكان is to occupy a certain space. The second meaning for مكان is to empower or to give the ability to control something. And that's basically to empower. Empower is to give the ability to control something. So if you occupy a place, then the resources are basically under your control. If you occupy a place, then not only the resources, but in terms of a number of different areas, they're basically under your control. They become the power that you would use in order to get to a certain advantage, a certain privilege, and a certain interest. So now when you look at التمكين, all right, and that relates to being in a specific place. So you look at this ayah, وَلَقَدْ مَكَّنَّاكُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. What you see, مَكَّنَّاكُم, there's a shadda right there. What is the shadda supposed to indicate? What the shadda indicates is, one, a gradual process. Two, this is talking about a repetition of something. Three, this is talking about some hyperbole possibly, or a number of different stresses, exaggeration, etc. Hyperbole, but we talked about the hyperbole in Lugha Arabiya, and we said it's not necessarily a form of exaggeration to necessarily reflect something that is not a reality of what it is, but it's more of rhetorical. We talked about that, so we said not always is it that way in Lugha Arabiya, so we can't always use hyperbole in Lugha Arabiya as a way to express the shadda. Okay, the other meaning for shadda is determination, okay, to determine something. But what does it mean in here? Well, before we go into the meaning of it, we first have to look at the word مكناكم and break it down. So let's break it down for a bit in order to understand, because the word مكناكم is a key word in Lugha Arabiya because it is actually speaking about a whole vision. I want you to look at this one. This is a vision. This is a mindset. How do we read the resources that we were given on earth? Whether we're speaking about time, we're speaking about place, we're speaking about different forces, different energies, different privileges that we have in this world. How do we understand these resources and these privileges? Do we take advantage of them? Do we read them as if we are gods? Or do we read them as we were given these tools to basically use them for a particular purpose? How do we understand these resources and what does it actually mean? Now, the word makana, it actually appeared in the Quran in so many different ayat, and that's why we cannot understand it unless we go to those different ayat and actually see the different context. All right, we're going to go there right now, inshallah. So, but first, I need to break down the word makana. So when you look at makana being the root, let's write that down for a bit and see how many additions we actually have on that root. Okay, we're going to go right there and we're going to write the word ma and ka and na. Okay, so if we write the root ma, ka, na, that actually means that we have a couple additions, and let's just see these additions right there. Number one, this is the root, ma, ka, na. So the shadda is an addition. Okay, and the a is an addition, and the kum is an addition to the root makana, because makana, here it is. This is right there. Everything else is an addition. So we know the kum is plural. That's the easiest one. Okay, we got rid of that one. What about the shadda? And what about the a? So the a right there is to basically reflect that this is talking about makana, to mean that it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Na. And what is the noon and the shadda right there? So this is not makana just alone, but this is, I want to break it down and write it down again, so you can actually see it and see and understand what we're talking about. So this actually is makana and another na and then kum. This is how it looks like. Or actually, I should say makana. I should put another kaf right there. This is what it looks like. The only roots are mim and kaf and one noon. So the extra kaf right there, makannakum, that's that shadda right there to reflect one, determination, two, repetition. In other words, generation after generation after generation, they lived given these privileges and determination from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And number three is that this is to let us know that there's a certain level of empowerment. Okay, let's see. The other part about the na, this na right there, makanna, this na right there, this one is to say that it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is I, that is Allah Almighty. Okay, this refers to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, makanna, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore this na is a plural na to basically reflect the glory from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, basically giving you this empowerment, but the glory belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you were given a portion of such empowerment, but the true power goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why he didn't say makantukum, but he said makannakum. So remember that the tamkeen, that the empowerment, that the power is going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the kum, and that one is for the plural, meaning all a human race, was basically given this tamkeen. So, okay, you explained makana. We said makana when once it can actually mean that this is talking about occupying a certain space, can include occupying a certain place to mean the person basically having the power to control the resources within that space. So, but in order to understand it better, we definitely have to go back to the different ayat that relate to that word tamkeen in order to fully understand it. And I really found this beautiful article that was written on Islam Online. Really nice article. And even if you cannot read Arabic, you could actually do this. You can go back to the article. Let me just give it to you right there. I'm going to share in the chat, and that way you could actually see it. Okay, I'm going to give it to you right there. And okay, here we go. And what you can do is that you can actually you can actually get it translated as well. What you're going to do, you're going to press these three dots right there, and then you're going to go all the way down to translate. Okay, and then you can translate it. I'm not going to use the Arabic, the English translation. The English translation is not always so accurate, but I'm just giving you some extra resources to help you at least get there. And at the end, of course, we're going to be using the original, the Lugha Arabiya, because I'm able to, one, let you see the ayat themselves and the words themselves, and two, I mean, I can actually give you the English translation on this side, but I want you to focus on those words because I really need you to be, I guess, be able to see the Lugha Arabiya in the Quran, because we're trying to do tafsir here. So since we're trying to do tafsir and not necessarily translation, that's why I need you to see the original. Okay, now when you look at the tamkeen itself, you could see a number of different stories. They basically emphasize the word tamkeen right there. Number one is the story of Prophet Yusuf, and number two is the story of Dhul Qarnayn. Those are probably the most important two stories, and perhaps maybe I should add on to it, Prophet Sulaiman and Dawood alayhi salam. We should have actually they should have actually added to that right there because tamkeen is also, I guess, it is emphasized in the story of Prophet Sulaiman and story Prophet Dawood alayhi salam, but we're just gonna at least see the meanings of tamkeen in the story of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam because the ayah literally says وَكَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا. Here's the same exact word that just appeared in Surah Al-Araf right there. Remember? Right there. So when it says وَلَقَدْ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُفَ, it is the same exact word that you see here. So in other words, sometimes the best way to understand a word is to understand it within a story. So within the story of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, we could say when it says وَلَقَدْ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُفَ, number one, he was a child that was basically of course, put in the well by his own brothers. He basically lost his support, his fatherly support, lost the resources, lost definitely the power. And here it is now, this baby or this young boy, toddler, maybe 5 years old, who knows how old he was exactly, but there he is. He's right now put in this abandoned well, and here he is, he's found by these people who actually sell him for really just a few pennies. That's why شَرَوْهُ بِثَمَنٍ بَخْسٍ دَرَاهِمَ مَعْدُودَةٍ, just a few pennies. They didn't even consider that he was of any worth. So they're like, yeah, we'll just take any pennies, nothing worth it. All right. And they just took just a few pennies for basically this boy that was found. And then Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam is then living, of course, as a slave in this castle, and then ends up not only betrayed, but ends up in a wrong way, basically being punished for refusing to do the wrong thing. You're punished for refusing to do the wrong thing, to do the right thing. Sorry. He's punished for doing the right thing, even though the king was aware of it. But at the end, he was basically still imprisoned for doing the right thing, which is respecting the king's honor. But then he gets punished for 7 years for doing the right thing. But certainly he was not too happy being in prison. And that's why he was asking those guys that were with him in prison to remember whenever they get out of prison, to remember their friend basically in prison and to seek basically clemency, but or at least to seek maybe out of prison to somehow get pardoned out of this place. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُفَ. That's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given basically the place, which later he basically becomes the treasurer within the government after being a person that was isolated in basically some dungeon. Now he is given a very high place. Now he's given a place of power. Now he's given the resources, and now he's basically given the social status. So now he's in a place of tamkeen, a place of tamkeen. And now, what does that mean? يَتَبَوَّأُ مِنْهَا حَيْثُ يَشَاءُ. Now, this is important. When you look at the word مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُفَ, when it says يَتَبَوَّأُ مِنْهَا, this is semicolon right there. In other words, what does this tamkeen look like? So the ayah continues to say يَتَبَوَّأُ مِنْهَا حَيْثُ يَشَاءُ. That's the first definition of tamkeen, is that they will have the empowerment or the power to basically, what is yatabawa? Yatabawa actually means to use the resources, to basically have the power to work freely, to engage in a certain amount of freedom, in a certain amount of empowerment, in a certain amount and a level of basically being capable of having the authority. All right. نُصِيبُ بِرَحْمَتِنَا مَنْ نَشَاءُ. This is basically to let us know that tamkeen is certainly a privilege. التمكين is a privilege, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, نُصِيبُ بِرَحْمَتِنَا مَن نَشَاءُ. How do I get this privilege? He basically said, وَلَا نُضِيعُ أَجْرَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. In order to get to this privilege, you need to be part of al-muhsinin. But aren't the disbelievers also having a tamkeen? We're gonna get there, but there's some good tamkeen and there's some tamkeen for a test. Keep that one in mind. Not every tamkeen is a privilege. Some tamkeen is a tamkeen of test. Keep that one in mind. You may have the money, but that money doesn't necessarily mean you are lucky to have it. It may actually be وَنَبْلُوَكُمْ بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ fitna. Keep that one in mind. Some tamkeen is a privilege because it is a rahmah, and some tamkeen is a test, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold you accountable for it. Okay, let's see the other story. Dhul Qarnayn. Well, Dhul Qarnayn, basically this king, and basically managed to perhaps expand in his tamkeen. Here we go. That's why the ayah says, إِنَّا مَكَّنَّا لَهُ فِي الْأَرْضِ وآتيناه من كل شيء سببا. Here's the second one. مكنا له في الأرض. He was given تمكين. Did he have political expansion? Did he have military power? Did he have knowledge? What kind of tamkeen did he actually have? Well, what we know is that the story of Dhul Qarnayn is letting us know آتيناه من كل شيء سببا فأتبع سببا, that he basically recognized the cause and effect of everything. He recognized whether we're talking about physics, or whether we're talking about chemistry, or no, whether we're talking about science in general, all the different types of different sciences. So he learned the cause and effect of things, and he was capable of using science to basically learn how to bend it or utilize it towards a good cause. That's what he used it for. He used it for a good cause. And we know the story of Dhul Qarnayn. He didn't want to necessarily give those group of people that complained about Ya'juj and Ma'juj and necessarily just give them a privilege like that and just utilize their privilege when they said, hey, can you create and can you make a dam between us and them? In other words, can you protect us from their savagery? Can you do something that will protect us? And he basically said, well, ما مكنني فيه ربي خير. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given me, مكنني فيه ربي. What did he attribute it to? He attributed it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, well, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given me is already khair, is already plentiful, is already magnificent. But I'm not going to give you a privilege like that without you investing in it. فأعينوني بقوة. I want you to give me manpower, and I want you yourself to build it. Because if I would build it for you, then you would just not recognize the privilege that you were given. And then therefore, you would just think that you're entitled, and you will not take care of it. You will not be considerate over the privilege that you were given. So the best thing to do is let you invest in it. And that's the same thing. Don't give your children these entitlements. Let them go fix their own food. Get up and fix your own room. Get up and you actually get into that contribution within the household, because you should not live thinking that I'm supposed to be there fixing you the food, fixing you everything, and that I'm supposed to be basically just letting you think that you are supposed to be getting these privileges without putting any effort. Okay, now when you look at makanna, that's the key thing that we want to get to. Now, it-tamkeen during the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِن يُرِيدُوا خِيَانَتَكَ فَقَدْ خَانُوا اللَّهَ مِن قَبْلُ فَأَمْكَنَ مِنْهُمْ وَاللَّهُ عَلِيمٌ حَكِيمٌ. Before that, of course, this is talking about the Battle of Badr. They basically had betrayed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as a result of their portrayal, فَأَمْكَنَ مِنْهُمْ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically took away their privileges. Did they have a certain power? They had a certain power, but as a result of what they had committed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala أَمْكَنَ مِنْهُمْ. He basically put another empowerment, another power to basically disempower them. And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically lets us know that there are certain things to give the positive tamkeen, the good tamkeen, which is number one, وعد الله الذين آمنوا منكم وعملوا الصالحات لا يستخلفنهم في الأرض. I'm going to make this one bigger so you could see it right there. وعد الله الذين آمنوا ومنكم وعملوا الصالحات. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically promised those that would believe and those that would act righteous. And لا يستخلفنهم في الأرض. And this is a form of an oath. It's a form of a qasam. How? كما استخلف الذين من قبلهم. Exactly the same pattern, exactly the same way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given basically al-khilafa. What is al-khilafa? Al-khilafa is, it is not a person, sitting on some kind of a throne and with a turban on his head and some little jewel on the top of his turban and basically, I don't know, holding some kind of a jewel or some kind of thing in his arm. And no, this isn't it. Al-khilafa is basically the empowerment, the power that you would use in order to basically apply the definitions of justice that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had defined as just and truth. So, وَلَيُمَكِّنَنَّ لَهُمْ دِينَهُمُ الَّذِي ارْتَضَى لَهُمْ. This one explains it. What does al-khilafa actually mean? It is basically to apply the deen. It is to apply the definition of justice, to apply the definition of legislature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had defined as the truth and what must be done and what must be implemented on ground. So what does al-khilafa actually mean? Al-khilafa means to apply, to implement the definitions of justice, the definitions of ethics, the definitions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had determined that they are the principles that you have to put on ground, whether on a social level, military level, political level, personal level, the list goes on and on. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had explained, well, what is going to be the price? What is going to be at least what the trade? Why are we even doing this? He said, وَلِيُبَدِّلَنَّهُم مِّن بَعْدِ خَوْفِهِمْ أَمْنًا. What am I doing the khilafa for? Why am I doing this tamkeen for? So now you've got al-khilafa. You've got the tools for it that you will be given. So al-khilafa, or at least to be in that position of power, is basically needing a certain number of different resources. Those resources that you would have to use in order to implement the purpose, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen. What is the end of this? Well, it's basically security. It's basically stability. It is peace in this dunya and in the akhirah. How can we attain that? يَعْبُدُونَنِي لَا يُشْرِكُونَ بِي شَيْئًا. You would worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the word worship is a lot more comprehensive than just making it as a place of ritual. The word worship, it includes basically putting this tamkeen, or this power, or these resources, basically according to the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, starting from avoiding shirk, worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, توحيد, and وَمَنْ كَفَرَ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. And whoever would go against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after that, whether we're speaking about go against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in faith, or whether going against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in action, which is why the word al-fasiqun was used. The word fasaqa actually means to take out the peel off the fruit, and which basically means that you are raising the chances and basically increasing the chances of that fruit decaying. So, in other words, when you remove the peel, you basically let that fruit get exposed to the different things in the air, to the different things that in the atmosphere, the environment, whatever it is, and it decays faster. So, in other words, when you look at Sharia, when you look at Tawheed, it is basically to preserve the society, and it is basically to help the society live in peace, instability, and ripen in a way that is healthy. So when you look at وَمَنْ كَفَرَ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ, this is to let us know that al-kufr actually means internal and external decay, internal to mean aqidah, external to mean sharia. Okay, because when you're talking about internal, you're talking about an internal faith, what you believe in. And if you're talking about external, what behaviors do you conduct? What kind of principles do you abide by? So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasized, فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. Then that's a corrupted society. Then that's a society that is basically living in decay. In other words, do not think that if a society appears to be civilized or appears to be somehow having some certain things in order, do not think that this is necessarily freedom or that this is necessarily to reflect that they are going towards prosperity, but it is actually going towards decay. It's exactly the same thing. Somebody can think that, hey, by taking off your hijab, by somehow wearing and dressing in an appropriate way, that somehow this is becoming free from any type of a restriction. But the truth of the matter, you are just expediting your own decay. The decay started out when you confused your definitions of what the definition of freedom means. When you confused your definition, thinking that I'm worshiping basically freedom, when in reality, you are worshiping shaitan that confused you with a new narrative and told you that by taking off your clothes, you are becoming free, and that by taking off your clothes, that somehow you are just becoming your own self. You're reflecting your own freedom, when the truth of the matter is that you are reflecting to worship shaitan. You are reflecting to basically take that definition that shaitan laid out, or his basically followers that are shayateen, whether humans or whether epistine, and all these different people, they're the ones that were basically Baal. Remember that. They were the ones that were defining things and making you think that it was in your service, when the truth of the matter, it was actually in their service. And now we could see right now all that Iran war was really to cover up a lot of the different things that were happening in the Epstein files that would indict Trump himself. But let's not get into that. But anyhow, all right. And that's the game that they would basically play. We had seen that a lot of the people that are, the big billionaires that are controlling, whether we're speaking about cartoons, Disney, we're talking about a lot of these things, even including university departments. And a lot of those that are actually they had the Nobel Prize or whatever it is, and we discovered that, oh my God, these people were actually given a Nobel Prize, not necessarily for what they had contributed in necessarily, but sometimes for perhaps their submission to another shaitan. Okay, let's not get into that, right? Okay, now what is the tamkeen that is a positive tamkeen, and how do we get it? So number one is that, let's look at this. The Prophet ﷺ, number one is that al-iman al-kamil, complete faith. And that's why, remember, when we talked about Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, what did we say? We basically said, here we go. The reason why he had the tamkeen was basically, وَلَا نُضِيعُ أَجْرَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. He was basically a muhsin. That's why he deserved that tamkeen, even though the situation was not actually in his favor. He was a slave, no backup, no social backup, no money, no tools to be in that position. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him the tamkeen for al-ihsan. Keep that one in mind. Not every privilege that you would necessarily get is necessarily coming from your own investment towards that. Certainly, you study, you're more likely to basically pass the exam. There's no question about that. But there's certain tamkeen that you will be given that is not necessarily something that you had the tools necessarily to get and the factors to get into that position. So a lot of things you would see that it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving them tamkeen, and tamkeen may be a privilege and maybe a test. Okay, so let's continue right there with shurut al-tamkeen. Number one is complete faith. And let's see what this hadith is saying. لا يزال طائفة من أمتي ظاهرين حتى يأتيهم أمر الله وهم ظاهرون. A group of the nation of the Prophet ﷺ, they will be ظاهرين. In other words, they will be basically on top of all. حتى يأتيهم أمر الله وهم ظاهرون. Until basically the matter of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is decreed, and they will be basically in the same tamkeen, in the same principle that they were carrying out, which is the principle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the whole thing about tamkeen is not an issue of boasting about a position or somehow being in that position in order to serve your dunya. The whole reason for tamkeen is, remember, it is to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why he said, وَلِيُمَكِّنَنَّ لَهُمْ دِينَهُمْ. The whole purpose of tamkeen is to use it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not to use it for a personal privilege or a personal interest, but it is to use it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why he said, حَتَّى يَأْتِيَهُمْ أَمْرُ اللَّهِ وَهُمْ ظَاهِرُونَ. They're using the empowerment, they're using the wealth, they're using the social status, they're using the different areas of perhaps maybe empowerment, whether military, science, whatever it is, money, etc., economy. They're using it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not for personal interest. Now that's why when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, when كَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُف, it is to let us know that the second privilege and the second shart, or the second condition for tamkeen, is to basically act in righteousness. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُف. In other words, use your own resources for that position that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had wanted you to basically implement it in. And which is why, remember Prophet Dawood alayhi salam, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَا دَاوُودَ مِنَّا فَضْلًا يَا جِبَالُ أَوِّبِي مَعَهُ وَالطَّيْرِ وَأَلَنَّا لَهُ الْحَدِيدِ أَنِ اعْمَلْ سَابِغَاتٍ وَقَدِّرْ فِي السَّرْدِ وَاعْمَلُوا صَالِحًا. Look at this one. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَا. We had given Dawood magnificent, this is the fadla, magnificent privileges, magnificent tamkeen, that is, and including even the mountains would be basically awibi ma'ah. It would obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with him. He would be reading, and the mountains would echo in the recitation of Prophet Dawood alayhi salam. And even the birds would follow the command of Prophet Dawood alayhi salam, and including iron. Steel would basically be under Prophet Dawood alayhi salam's power, where he would be capable of bending, and he would be capable of making shields. He would be capable of making huge pots to feed the army and to feed basically the people. In other words, when you look at i'mal sabighatin, what is that supposed to reflect? That he basically had two things. Number one, i'mal sabighatin wa qaddir fi sard. This is to reflect that there was a great army and there was a great social amount of social justice. And he said, وَاعْمَلُوا صَالِحًا. This tamkeen was in order to implement it towards implementing salah, implementing the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, implementing piety. So in order to get to the tamkeen, what are we supposed to do? Well, it's very important. Don't just make tawakkul, but make tawakkul. What's the difference? Tawakkul is depending on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not using and not utilizing the necessary elements in order to get there. So, for example, you're like, Ya Allah, please let me pass the test when you didn't even study. You didn't even study. You need to study to pass the test. You need to put in and utilize the resources in order to go up in probably passing your test or probably advocating for yourself. You need to put in a certain level of investment. That's how you're going to get it. You will not get it by having some tawakkul without putting any investment. And that's why when you're talking about al-akhdh bil asbab, it basically means that you have to utilize the necessary tools in order to get there, which is why Dhul Qarnayn, he said, وَآتَيْنَاهُ مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ سَبَبًا فَأَتْبَعَ سَبَبًا. Dhul Qarnayn, how did he get to the tamkeen? Well, he needed to invest in probably science, in probably military power, in probably strategic planning, and the list goes on and on. And you cannot get that tamkeen unless you invest in the different factors and the different tools that are necessary to help you get to the tamkeen. And certainly, the most important tool for tamkeen is knowledge, whether we're speaking about science, whether we're speaking about different kinds of sciences in different areas, no matter what area that was. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala started out with the word اقرأ, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says يرفع الله الذين آمنوا منكم والذين أوتوا العلم درجات, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will elevate those that are in faith and those that basically have the ilm. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will elevate them in different levels. Elevate them in different levels, in different levels of whether we're speaking about status or whether we're speaking about privileges or whether we're speaking about darajat, in different levels of power, or whether we're speaking about different levels of tamkeen. That tamkeen, that empowerment, that you need to invest in it. It doesn't just happen like that and say, all I need to be is from al-muhsineen. I'll do more qiyam al-layl and that's it. No, that's not enough. You need to do a number of different areas of homework in order to basically get into that discipline. Ilm is not enough. Ilm and discipline both have to go together in order to get to the tamkeen. Ilm and discipline. Knowledge and discipline. What's the difference? Knowledge is the information. You went to school, you probably memorized the Quran, you probably, listened to lectures, etc. Good for you. That's one side of it. Discipline is to implement the wisdom, to implement the ilm, and discipline is not implementing it once. Discipline is the grit to make a pattern of implementation and a pattern of that amal salih. Remember when we did it yesterday and we talked about the ayah. We were mentioning in the ayah when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had mentioned, let's see which ayah that was. فَأُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ خَسِرُوا أَنفُسَهُم بِمَا كَانُوا بِآيَاتِنَا يَظْلِمُونَ. Remember that piece, that ayah when we talked about that right there. خَسِرُوا أَنفُسَهُم بِمَا كَانوا بِآيَاتِنَا يَظْلِمُونَ. And we said خسروا أنفسهم, they lost their souls. Well, بما كانوا بآياتنا يظلمون. And we said what actually lets the person lose their nafs is the behavior that they would conduct. You want to change your nafs, you need to change the pattern of your behavior. You want to reprogram your nafs, reprogram your behavior by changing the program by changing the behavior, by changing the patterns of what you conduct in your lifestyle. That is what is going to change your nafs. By you teaching yourself how to make a new system in how you eat, how you clean the house around you, how you basically get into that discipline, that's what will discipline your nafs as well. You want to discipline your nafs, you have to discipline your behavior. They both go together. Yes, إن الله لا يغير ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم. How do I change my nafs? Yes, certainly you have to change your niyyah. You have to change your intention. If your intention has good in it, then that inshallah will bring about this investment in you wanting to change your behavior. How do I change my behavior? You basically put in that niyyah that I want to do it. Even though, just keep this one in mind, you may do qiyam al-layl. In the beginning, it feels so good. At one point, you're going to lose this sensation. Same thing. When somebody converts to Islam, in the beginning of their conversion, they feel so good. All of a sudden, later on, they start losing it. And they'll come and they'll say, I lost it. Where's that sensation that I had at once? We have to recognize that when you speak about madarij as-salikin, think of it as a stair. In the beginning, you hold on to the stair and you're like, I got there. I'm so happy. I'm finally there. But guess what? In order to go up on the stairs, the further up, the more effort you need to put. The more effort you need to invest in. Why? Because you need to hold on tighter. And guess what? You're looking down and you're fighting even stronger gravity. And guess what? That puts you more prone to falling the higher you go up. And then when we understand madarij as-salikin, in the beginning, there's that sweetness, but there's at one point, there's the sweetness of jihad of the nafs. And that's another level of sweetness. Getting up, even if you had lost the sweetness of qiyam al-layl, enjoy the sweetness of your jihad. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you the reward of al-jihad, and even if you didn't feel the sweetness of whatever you're investing in. Keep that one in mind. So when you look at that level, let's take this one down. When you look at that, وَالَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمَ دَرَجَاتٍ, you look at those darajat. How do we understand it? There's a daraja that you will find halawat al-iman, and there's a daraja you will find halawat al-jihad. And there's another daraja you will find halawat al-ihsan. Halawat al-jihad is another type of a beauty. Is that when you're putting in the effort to keep you going, I'm going to strive even more. That's halawat al-jihad. All right, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, lets us know, وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُم مَّا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ. It is not enough to just have that ilm and just the knowledge. Certainly, you probably did your homework in trying to learn Islam, trying to learn the deen. Good for you. But guess what? There's a certain moment that you have to invest in halawat al-jihad, in the beauty of investing in that way that you might strive, that you will feel the challenge. that you will feel the challenge and that you will strive no matter what, even if you probably could not find the fruit of your jihad, but you will keep going. So, وَأَعِدُّ لَهُم مَّا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ. Certainly the context of this is actually talking about jihad, meaning jihad, in military. And it's talking about, well, you have to prepare the means to basically be capable of defeating the opponent. But there's also preparing the means to defeat shaitan as well. So when we're speaking about al-quwwa, we're speaking about the different types of empowerment that is necessary to defeat the challenges. Okay, the other thing of getting tamkeen is al-adl, justice. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُكُمْ أَن تُؤَدُّوا الْأَمَانَاتِ إِلَى أَهْلِهَا وَإِذَا حَكَمْتُم بَيْنَ النَّاسِ أَن تَحْكُمُوا بِالْعَدْلِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders you to give people's property, the trust, basically, to be a trustworthy person back to where it belongs. And when you judge between people, to judge injustice, to judge injustice at the end of the day is that the reason for tamkeen is to apply the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's to live the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you cannot live in contradiction with what you're trying to head to in terms of purpose, which is al-adl, which is al-amana, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words. And then use a different tool to get there. And that's why when we're speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just keep it in mind that when you put in adl, you put in justice, you put in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ethics, that's what will channel your efforts to tamkeen. Let's look at this one. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, the leader in Khurasan, he basically said, إن أهل خراسان قوم ساءت رعيتهم وإنه لا يصلح إلا السيف والصوت فإن رأى أمير المؤمنين أن يأذن لي في ذلك. Khurasan is basically the area of Afghanistan. That's Khurasan. Afghanistan, parts of Uzbekistan, parts of those areas, that area right there. Okay, those are Khurasan. All right, what happened? So the person that is the deputy acting on behalf of Umar bin Abdul Aziz, who's actually the great-grandson of Umar bin Khattab, and he was the Khalifa. What did he say? He sent him a note and he said, these people of Khurasan, they're basically requiring discipline. So I want you to give me the permission to use sword and salt, to use the sword and to use salt. What is salt? Salt is basically to whip them. In other words, he's basically asking for military power and basically to use force against them. So he said, if basically Amir al-Mu'mineen gives me the permission to do so, then do so. But then Umar ibn Khattab responds and he says, أما بعد فقد بلغني كتابك تذكر فيه أن أهل خراسان قد ساءت رعيتهم وأنه لا يصلح إلا السيف والصوت فقد كذبت بل يصلحهم العدل والحق فابسط ذلك فيهم والسلام. Simple, straight message. Said, I read your note. You were saying that the people of Khurasan, that their mannerisms are basically gone and that we have to use nothing but force. You had lied. What will actually get them into going the right direction is only adl and haq. It is justice and truth. So display that amongst them and peace. In other words, display that amongst them and you will see the difference in the society. All right, how do we understand all of that? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically here mentions الذين إن مكناهم في الأرض أقاموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة وآمروا بالمعروف ونهوا عن المنكر ولله عاقبة الأمور. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says those that if when we give them tamkeen, what do they do with it? The tamkeen, they would perform salah. They would give in charity. They would order for what is good and they would forbid what is evil. And وَلِلَّهِ عَاقِبَةُ الْأُمُورِ. And everything returns to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, this is extremely important to keep in mind because if we lost our tamkeen, the question is, why did we lose it? We were one time a great nation. What happened? Number one, we're talking about shuyuu' al-dhulm. We're talking about that dhulm, oppression. We're talking about injustice becoming something that is prevalent. Whether we're speaking about parents abusing their children or children abusing their parents or brother abusing sister or sister abusing brother, that is dhulm. No dhulm is acceptable. And we had seen that if you were to ask your grandmother, your great grandmother, how the society was like, you're going to say that a lot of dhulm was prevalent during that society, during the Muslim society back then. And certainly, whether we're speaking about the dhulm being prevalent, whether we're speaking about an individual level or whether we're speaking about a government level, we would basically see that the result is that we're going to be losing that tamkeen. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَتِلْكَ الْقُرَىٰ أَهْلَكْنَاهُمْ لَمَّا ظَلَمُوا وَجَعَلْنَا لِمَهْلِكِهِمْ مَوْعِدًا. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically destructed the different cities, the different villages, when لَمَّا ظَلَمُوا. What they considered injustice was basically what that society was judging based on, then certainly what you're going to do, what you're going to see, the result basically going to come up, and what are you going to see? There was going to be an appointed date that this is going to be a destructed society. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا كَانَ رَبُّكَ لِيُهْلِكَ الْقُرَىٰ بِظُلْمٍ وَأَهْلُهَا مُصْلِحُونَ. For the Lord Almighty does not destruct a city in oppression when and if the city itself and the people within that city are pious. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also tells us about the story of Fir'aun. إِنَّ فِرْعَوْنَ عَلَا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَجَعَلَ أَهْلَهَا شِيَعًا يَسْتَضْعِفُ طَائِفَةً مِّنْهُمْ يُذَبِّحُ أَبْنَاءَهُمْ وَيَسْتَحْيِي نِسَاءَهُمْ إِنَّهُ كَانَ مِنَ الْمُفْسِدِينَ. Why was Fir'aun, the tamkeen that he had, why was it destructed? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, he was abusing a group of people and he was killing their own children, and he was leaving their women alive to basically get abused, whether it's in different forms of abusing their women, and he was basically amongst the corrupt ones. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically lets us know, وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا إِلَى الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا فَتَمَسَّكُمُ النَّارُ وَمَا لَكُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ مِنْ أَوْلِيَاءَ ثُمَّ لَا تُنصَرُونَ. And this is important. What is وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا? In other words, those that had oppressed others, don't let them get away with it. Stop them. Stop them whenever they go wrong. Do not let them get carried away with abusing others. But there must be a limit and an end to their oppression. And if you do not do so, فَتَمَسَّكُمُ النَّارُ, then hellfire would come to you. And وَمَا لَكُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ مِنْ أَوْلِيَاءَ, and then you would not have any authority, any empowerment, any tamkeen basically, and then you would not be victorious. The other reason for kufran al-ni'am, the other reason for the loss of tamkeen is the denial of the different blessings that you have. Not seeing the blessings. If you can't see the blessings, then you're not going to be using those privileges. If you're not going to see the blessings, all you do is just complain about what you do not have, and you don't see the blessings that you have, then you're not going to be capable of getting the tamkeen either. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الَّذِينَ بَدَّلُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ كُفْرًا وَأَحَلُّوا قَوْمَهُمْ دَارَ الْبَوَارِ. Do you not see those that basically had replaced, instead of ni'mat Allah, instead of seeing the privileges, instead of seeing the tamkeen, instead of seeing the resources that they were given, what do they do in place of that? Kufran. They're just continuously denying that they have any privilege. They're just living in denial after denial after denial. And then that's kufr. And then they ended up basically denying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them anything. What do they end up getting? Well, they would lose their tamkeen because they couldn't even see these resources. They couldn't even see the blessings. أَحَلُّوا قَوْمَهُمْ دَارَ الْبَوَارِ. They didn't just affect themselves, but they even affected the people around them. Don't be around complainers. Those that complain too much, their life and the life of those that are living around them will basically become hell. Dar al-bawar. Dar of nothing, because they will reflect on them. They will not even see the privileges anymore. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had to let us know, وَضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا قَرْيَةً كَانَتْ آمِنَةً مُطْمَئِنَّةً يَأْتِيهَا رِزْقُهَا رَغَدًا مِنْ كُلِّ مَكَانٍ فَكَفَرَتْ بِأَنْعُمِ اللَّهِ فأذاقها الله لباس الجوع والخوف بما كانوا يصنعون. When these people, it was a qarya, it was a village, they basically were living amina, security, they were basically getting all the different resources and in abundance from everywhere. But then when they denied Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and when they didn't even see that privilege, and they started basically seeing nothing but, why don't we have this? Why don't we have that? And they started complaining about everything, and they denied Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give them any resources. And then أذاقها الله لباس الجوع. That's when they will end up basically being covered, exactly like a garment of hunger, fear. For what? For what they were doing, for what they had done. What did they do? Remember, what they did was basically كفرت بأنعم الله. It's exactly like we were saying earlier, that what you would behave in, the discipline is going to affect the nafs. The discipline, the behavior that you would conduct, that frequent lifestyle, that becomes the wiring in your brain. The wiring in your brain is basically what would also determine the wiring in your nafs. So therefore, if you want to change anything, you basically have to avoid committing sin. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَخَلَفَ مِن بَعْدِهِمْ خَلْفٌ أَضَاعُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَاتَّبَعُوا الشَّهَوَاتِ فَسَوْفَ يَلْقَوْنَ غَيًّا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, the nations after them, they basically came in, they lost their prayer, they stopped being committed not to their prayer, and they followed their own desires, and then فَسَوْفَ يَلْقَوْنَ غَيًّا. And therefore, what they will be finding is nothing but not only defeat, but nothing but regression after regression. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will let them go into that corruption after corruption till the fall, and the magnificent fall in hellfire. Allahul Musta'an. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets us know, وَإِذَا أَرَدْنَا أَن نُهْلِكَ قَرْيَةً أَمَرْنَا مُتْرَ فِيهَا فَفَسَقُوا فِيهَا فَحَقَّ عَلَيْهَا الْقَوْلُ فَدَمَّرْنَاهَا تَدْمِيرًا. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had willed, or whenever a city they basically فَسَقُوا فِيهَا, whenever they would take off the garment of principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's principles, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's definition of ethics and a definition of principles, and then continue to go into their own their own definitions, and they consider themselves basically as the center, then فَحَقَّ عَلَيْهَا الْقَوْلُ. Then that's what's going to decree the order, the decree of the Lord Almighty, and it will basically lead to destruction. And that's why even the Prophet ﷺ, when Zainab al-Mu'mineen, she said the Prophet ﷺ had entered one day فَزِعًا. He came in scared, panicking, and he said, لا إله إلا الله ويل للعرب من شر قد اقترب. Woe unto the Arab from a danger coming near. What is it? He said, فتح اليوم من ردم يأجوج ومأجوج مثل هذه. Today, يأجوج and مأجوج. يأجوج, the Gog and Magog, يأجوج and مأجوج, an opening from the dam that was surrounding them had opened, and he made a halaqa. He made like a circle between his fingers. And Zainab said, will we get destructed when there are still pious people around us? He said, Na'am, إذا كثر الخبث. Yes, if khabath, if illicit behavior, if wrongdoing becomes the pattern, then certainly even the salihin will basically get destructed along with everyone else. Now, this is extremely important. How to engage that tamkeen, how to get to that tamkeen, it is basically something that we have to understand first. What tamkeen means and what the tamkeen is for. A tamkeen is not just, yes, let me be in power, let me get the resources, because if you don't know what these resources are supposed to be used for, and where these resources are to be invested in, then these resources will be basically the resources that will be held against you on Judgment Day. You can have money, but if you're wandering it and you're wasting it and you're not using it for the purpose that you were given tamkeen for, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will basically use it to hold you accountable. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically lets us know that that tamkeen can either be, may be a privilege and may even be a disadvantage that you will be held accountable for. A very good article was also this one, letting us, going for التمكين and how a tamkeen could be something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may give, and something that can be tamkeen ibtila wa ikhtibar. Can be a tamkeen that can be something that will be a test for you. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala it says right there, قال الذي عنده علم من الكتاب أنا آتيك به قبل أن يرتد إليك طرفك فلما رآه مستقرا عنده قال هذا من فضل ربي ليبلوني أأشكر أم أكفر وَمَنْ شَكَرَ فَإِنَّمَا يَشْكُرُ نَفْسَهُ. So what did he have? He basically had a certain level of علم من الكتاب. That is the jinn. Basically had a certain level of علم من الكتاب from basically the books. And he said, I will be capable of bringing Queen Saba's throne before you even blink. And then Prophet Sulaiman عليه السلام, he said, قال هذا من فضل ربي ليبلوني أشكر أم أكفر. This is key. That this tamkeen, this empowerment that he had, that jinn, the controlling the birds, controlling the resources, having the resources, steel, iron, whatever it is, all these different things are basically under his power. That's in order, ليبلوني. It's an ibtila. It's to test, will I be thankful or will I deny? Part of denial is to deny that it is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and thinking that you deserved it, that you deserved this tamkeen, or thinking that this tamkeen that I had is basically something that I was so smart to get. That's kufr, because any tamkeen is supposed to be attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. هذا من فضل ربي. This is from the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's what Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam was expressing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given me this tamkeen to test me. Will I be thankful or will I deny? And will I attribute it to just me being so smart and I just figured things out? And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقَطَّعْنَاهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ أُمَمًا مِّنْهُمُ الصَّالِحُونَ وَمِنْهُمْ دُونَ ذَلِكَ وَبَلَوْنَاهُمْ بِالْحَسَنَاتِ وَالسَّيِّئَاتِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, basically, they were divided, or they were basically in different nations. Some were pious and others were not as that. And وَبَلَوْنَاهُمْ بِالْحَسَنَاتِ وَالسَّيِّئَاتِ. We had, this is the word, بَلَوْنَاهُمْ بِالْحَسَنَاتِ وَالسَّيِّئَاتِ. They were tested with the good things and with the bad things. Hasanat doesn't mean the good deed, but this is actually talking about the good privileges. السيئات are the different challenges. Are they going to see the challenges as basically as something that is necessarily just a challenge? Well, I'll just give up on it, or are they going to see the challenge as an ibtila for me to grow? Are they going to see al-hasana as something that they earned it because they deserved it? Or are they going to see the hasana or the good things or the privileges, basically something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them? And that's why he said right there, when we're speaking about tamkeen itself, it can be tamkeen mukafa. It can be a reward, just like in Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, and just like, of course, when we're looking at the tamkeen for different prophets or different messengers, etc., that tamkeen was basically some of it, just like when we're talking about Prophet Musa alayhi salam. Yes, certainly went through certain challenges, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him the tamkeen, gives Prophet Ismail a certain tamkeen, gives each and every single one. But that's in order for us to actually learn that. And certainly when we understand it tamkeen through the Quran and Sunnah, we basically have the right vision for it. So you look at وَلَقَدْ مَكَّنَّاكُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. That's basically tell us it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that gave us that tamkeen. It isn't necessarily something that we were deserving it, but we would see it as something that we may be held accountable for, and we need to invest in it to make sure that we are paying, let's call it the tax, by submitting it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And وَجَعَلْنَا لَكُمْ فِيهَا مَعَايِشَ قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us basically ma'ayish. What is ma'ayish? Ma'ayish is basically the different privileges in this life. Ma'ayish, basically the different resources in this life. In other words, life in itself is a resource. Life and the different resources, drinking, having good health, having basically the different things that will help you overcome different challenges, those themselves are basically privileges that we must see as tools to get to Jannah. That's it, tamkeen. And that's why he said, قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ. Very few people are thankful for this tamkeen. Very few people are thankful for the resources. Very few people are recognizing these resources. That's why when you look at قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ, part of being Muslim is being shakir. Part of being Muslim is being thankful. Part of being Muslim is recognizing these resources. Even the challenges are resources. Yes, challenges can be resources to help you, just like when we were talking about earlier, that there's a time when you may not feel the beauty of probably your jihad, or probably the beauty of your qiyam al-layl, or the beauty of the different things, but then that's the thing, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may take it away in order for you to put in more effort to get to it. How do we work towards it? That jihad is the jihad of discipline. That's tazkiyah. Tazkiyah is basically a way to rewire your brain, to rewire and reshape a new identity of you. What type of an identity? An identity that doesn't just say La ilaha illallah, just a word, but La ilaha illallah as a paradigm, as a pattern that you would apply in life, that you would implement in life, in your behavior, That's why I remember Surah Al-Muddathir. يا أيها المدثر قم فأنذر ربك فكبر ثيابك فطهر. There's a certain discipline that you have to make as a rewiring in your brain, in ربك فكبر, in the way you would see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the center, but there's also a center that you have to work on, which is ثيابك فطهر والرجز فاهجر ولا تمنن تستكثر. There's a certain wiring that you have to work on in your life and make it as a daily discipline. Inshallah, we will وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَاكُمْ ثم صورناكم ثم قلنا للملائكة اسجدوا لآدم فسجدوا إلا إبليس لم يكن من الساجدين. And we had created you, and then that's what ثم expresses, and then we had shaped you, and we had told the angels to prostrate to Adam. They all prostrated except Iblis. He was not amongst the prostrators. So this is where we're going to leave off today, inshallah. And sorry, but my throat is really hurting me now. All right, let me see the questions right there. Let's see right there. Is it correct to think that every haraj we may experience, there is sharh? Why would some modern scholars use Syriac to explain hur? No, they're not scholars. The modern people that are using Syriac to explain hur, those are not scholars. Those are deviant people that would say that. Those are not scholars. They're not scholars of Islam whatsoever. They're basically deviant people that were given the privileges by different institutions to misinterpret Islam, to take it and empty it out of what it actually is sent for and sent of. Absolutely not. They're not scholars whatsoever. If any person that says that il-hur is coming from Syriac and is to mean grapes or anything of that, right on the spot, this person basically ceased to be in any shape or form alim bil Islam, because the first and the beginning of learning Islam or learning Quran is basically through Lugha Arabiya. If they can't even figure out that inna anzalnahu Qur'anan Arabiyya, and then they wanted to interpret the Quran using other than Arabic, that's on the same spot that they had fallen, and definitely they lack ilm. They cannot be scholars. Do they know they spoke? No, those aren't scholars there. Okay, let's see. So Prophet Muhammad's lack of literacy is not blameworthy, but for us it is. Okay, fair enough. So the Prophet ﷺ, Sayyidah Aisha actually said that the Prophet ﷺ did later learn some writing, but it wasn't necessarily being, a professional in writing, but he did learn some writing. That's why he would say قاعر الميم or قاعر الباء or whatever, and he would basically instruct them on what to do. So the Prophet ﷺ did later learn some reading or writing, but was not necessarily professional in it. So the Prophet ﷺ, when he was told اقرأ, he said ما أنا بقارئ, because he did not have basically the ilm to read or write at the time. Okay, he didn't have the ilm, and certainly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was teaching him that اقرأ kitab Allah, read later the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, ilm and discipline are both needed for tamkeen. Changing your behavior is difficult. Okay, that is right. You lose the zeal and wonder what happened. Okay, what do you do when you feel really bad anxiety while moving forward and learning and changing yourself? What do you do when you basically do that? Number one is just remember that anxiety can sometimes be a good thing and can sometimes be a bad thing. Okay, anxiety and generally evil is not always bad. If we did not have insecurity or probably the illnesses, etc., we would not have been capable of striving to educate ourselves about illnesses, medicine, or probably ways to secure ourselves, or architecture and building and all of these different things. So some evil is actually good, and some anxiety is actually good. In our modern times, I think we are always speaking of ways to uplift any discomfort, because we thought and we had lived in a lifestyle of entitlement, and that's what actually is bringing in anxiety. I would claim that a lot of the anxiety that is coming in is within the younger generation specifically, is actually a result of many living entitled, and then whenever they're challenged with anything, they all of a sudden would hit and feel that anxiety because they're not used to it. But what we are supposed to be disciplined in is letting us know that discomfort and getting out of our comfort zone and a certain level of challenge is actually healthy to make us strive towards making a change. So not every single anxiety is necessarily something that we're supposed to be healing from. Sometimes anxiety is necessary in order to get us to strive. So keep that one in mind. Not every ibtila is necessarily evil. Some ibtila, remember, إن الله إذا أحب المؤمن ابتلاه. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves a believer, He may put them in ibtila. In other words, in a certain level of anxiety. So certain levels of anxiety, they can make you or break you. Keep that in mind. They can make you or break you. Okay, so let's see. The sister also says, so should we speak up against the leaders when committing oppression? I'm only asking because some people argue it is wrong, which I found odd because leaders are for the people, so we should speak against it. They often argue that is doing greater harm by encouraging rebellions against the leaders, and safety of the people is a priority. Sometimes they use Islam to silence voices that speak against oppression. Also, the oppression committed by the previous generations, we lost. Okay, those are called madkhali. If there's any group of people that I hate after Zionists more, it's madkhaliya. Period. All right? I'll say it straightforward. Zionism is the biggest oppression, and another tool of Zionism is basically that Madkhali group that in the name of Islam, they want us to basically give a justification or stay silent from those puppets that are basically acting in favor of Zionism, in favor of basically those oppressive regimes. They are using in the name of Islam to silence people from speaking up against injustice. And they're misinterpreting the religion. They're misinterpreting a hadith, they're misinterpreting ayat, and they're telling us to stay quiet. No. مَعْذِرَةً إِلَىٰ رَبِّكُمْ وَلَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ. Even if there may be no change happening, standing against oppression, standing against injustice is basically what Islam came for. Islam came to basically announce La ilaha illallah in two things, in Aqidah and in Sharia. So those that would misinterpret the religion and think that we're supposed to basically stay quiet and let those oppressive regimes continue their oppression. Anyways, those regimes were not Muslim from the beginning when they actually went against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they're fighting the deen. So why would we even consider them as necessarily Muslim regimes when they're fighting the deen? They're actually fighting and imprisoning those scholars because they are saying La ilaha illallah. Because وَمَا نَقَمُوا مِنْهُمْ إِلَّا يُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ. Zionists and Madkhalis. Sorry, Madkhalis, no apology, but I will say it straightforward. Okay, here we go. Okay, sorry. Sorry, that really hit a nerve. Okay, the book, Arabic Ustad, the book, what is Madkhali? Okay, what is madkhali? Okay, okay. Um, okay, what is madkhali? Okay, madkhali is, okay, should I take you there? Okay, so it's a Salafi group that was basically designed by the Saudi regime, and it was also, I would say, used by some scholars, and I will say, yeah, there were some were actually scholars. Okay, and that's Rabi al-Madkhali and his group. And is he a scholar? He's a scholar of hadith. There's no question about that. Okay, a scholar of hadith and a great scholar of hadith. But then even if it's a scholar, they may sometimes, one, be bought, sometimes they may find their interest, and sometimes they misinterpret the religion, especially when it relates to perhaps maybe the reality. Maybe they were too fearful to speak up the truth. Maybe they were basically blinded from seeing the reality of what was happening. That's a long story. I'll just make it short right there. So they're basically benefiting from these regimes. And certainly they were assigned by these regimes, and certainly misused their ilm in order to silence people, to silence the Muslims, to silence those that work basically for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they basically, Ya Allah, you really hit a very hard nerve. La ilaha illallah. I don't think there's any group that was more and that had done more harm onto the ummah than two groups, Madkhali and ISIS. Those are the two groups that harmed the ummah. All right. Zionists, I mean, he's adaw anyways. All right. But those two groups, Madkhali and ISIS, Allahul Musta'an. All right. I'll just keep it short, right? Maybe yeah, Allahul Musta'an. All right. So there are other questions. Let's see. Can you please share the last article that you showed us? Oh, the last article? Yeah, sure. The one from Islam Web? Sure. And here we go. Let me see. Right there. I'll put it for everyone. Here we go. Sorry, but here we go. And the other sister, let's see. An oppressed cursing frequently, is this right? An oppressed cursing frequently, is that right? If you mean by cursing, you mean using bad words, that's not acceptable in Islam. The Prophet ﷺ said, ليس المؤمن بالطعان ولا اللعان ولا الفاحش ولا البذيء. A mu'min is not ta'an, is not a person that is ta'an to basically just start speaking ill of people, like ta'an, where you're attacking people, in that type of attack. Wala la'an, and not cursing the situation or even complaining too much. Wala al-fahish wala al-badhi, and does not use words of profanity, like maybe things like you understand, words that are used a lot in social media to cuss. That's actually against what it means to be a mu'min, even if it may be appearing that, oh, it's being cool. It is not being cool. It is definitely not a mu'min behavior. Okay. What about if okay, what if she's oppressed by her husband? Okay. If you mean by cursing, if you mean by that complaining, لا يحب الله الجهر بالسوء من القول إلا من ظلم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dislikes that people would announce evil unless they were oppressed. If this woman is, I guess, beaten up by her husband every single day, whatever it is, okay, and then she came and she said, hey, I need help. I'm being beaten up. I'm being violated. My rights are violated, etc. Then in that situation, that would not be haram. She has the right to seek justice and has the right to uplift oppression from herself. So that's basically what it means. So إلا من ظلم, unless you were oppressed. All right. So understanding it in the right context, understanding it in the right circumstance. So if you mean by cursing, you mean by complaining, then that's two different things. Cursing is to use words of curse, but complaining in order to seek ways of support when you are oppressed, then that's a different story. All right. Did I answer that one? Are awliyaullah higher level than those who receive tamkeen? Well, awliyaullah, they're the ones that also get tamkeen. Awliyaullah would get tamkeen too. But tamkeen, it can also be a process as well. There's tamkeen on a personal level. Maybe you had a degree, you managed to get a degree, you managed to basically get money, you managed to get social status. That's tamkeen, okay? That's tamkeen. You had tamkeen to probably be the one to get the charisma. Here's a certain type of tamkeen. So there's, let's call it tamkeen that is minimal tamkeen, and there's the bigger tamkeen, and that's al-khilafa if we're talking about a government level. Okay, so every single one, if you think of tamkeen, if you were to interpret it as, I would say divide it like a smaller level of tamkeen, that's one side. You can have it at a personal level, and you can have tamkeen that, no, you were seeing at a society. The whole society basically got tamkeen. They had a certain level of empowerment. That's also tamkeen. So what are we looking at? Okay, what are we looking at and how we read that tamkeen, whether on an individual level or whether on a level, maybe society level. So how do we read this tamkeen? All right, I hope I explained it. If anybody would like to unmute themselves, go ahead, my friends. Can't we say that mothers and fathers have tamkeen? Oh, absolutely. Mothers and fathers, they definitely have tamkeen. And that's why with tamkeen actually comes a responsibility. Tamkeen is not tashrif, it is taklif. It is not a tashrif, it is a taklif. It's not an honor, it's a responsibility. Of course you have tamkeen, but at one point, this tamkeen is going to grow smaller and smaller because your power, your money, all of that is going to basically become minimized little by little when the children start getting tamkeen. And this is normal. And many times, fathers especially, by the way, many times they get into depression. They get into depression after losing their tamkeen if they're doing it for the sake of dunya. So they start feeling that, one time I was actually the one to give orders. I was the one that was in power. And the woman, of course, goes through stage where she becomes more independent, etc. Then the father starts losing, I guess, that sense of tamkeen, that sense of power, empowerment. But if you're doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you remember that this tamkeen that you were given was a taklif, not a tashrif. So you start looking at it from a different angle. At the end, you had done your job. Your children are right now growing. Your children right now are growing, and now they have the responsibility, and they'll be held accountable. They'll be held accountable. Certainly, we would want our children to be at the best place of iman, the best place of the best place of order, discipline, etc. But at the end of the day, they have to basically get into that level that they will be given tamkeen. What are they going to be doing with it? What are they going to be doing with the money? What are they going to be doing when they are probably not in need of their parents? That's why when you look at birr al-walidain is a different level. Why? Because this person used to be the person to order you. This person used to be the person that had the upper hand. Now you have the upper hand. Certainly, the parents are going to be losing their tamkeen at one point. Are you going to maintain the principle? Or are you going to abuse that tamkeen that you have right now and abuse your parents with it? And that's why عقوق الوالدين is the worst خلق. The worst خلق by far is عقوق الوالدين. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. When those children would start getting tamkeen, and then they start using it against those that had given them the tamkeen, their own parents. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give the akhlaq to our children, ourselves, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us amongst those that would have the tamkeen and use it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ameen, Ya Rabbi, ameen, ameen. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give our children the best of akhlaq and give us the best of akhlaq and make us from those that will have tamkeen for the good cause, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and use that tamkeen for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ummah, give us as an ummah, give us tamkeen to uplift oppression of those that were oppressed, and let us get that tamkeen to bring justice onto the world. Subhanakallahum bihamdik. Let's see. She said tamkeen is both a privilege and a trial simultaneously. Absolutely. That's exactly what we said. We said tamkeen can be a privilege and can be an ibtila. We were just talking about it earlier. Yes, tamkeen can be an ibtila. نسأل Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us amongst those that will use the tamkeen for His sake, use the ilm, use the adl, use the power, and use all areas of tamkeen for His sake and only for His sake. Allahumma ameen. So, subhanakallah wa bihamdik nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha